December 18, 1943. Wolfsschanze, East Prussia. Generaloberst Alfred Jodl set down his coffee cup and laughed so hard that tears formed at the corners of his eyes. Across the mahogany briefing table, 3 other senior Wehrmacht officers joined in the mirth as they reviewed the latest intelligence report from occupied France. The Americans were supposedly planning a massive amphibious assault across the English Channel, and the details were so absurd that Jodl initially thought the report was a joke planted by Allied counterintelligence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touched you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The document described an invasion force of unprecedented scale. Thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of men, all to be landed on heavily fortified French beaches defended by the Atlantic Wall, the most formidable coastal defense system ever constructed. Jodl read the key passage aloud to his colleagues, his voice dripping with mockery. The Americans believe they can transport an entire army across open water, land it on fortified beaches under direct fire, and establish a sustainable beachhead against prepared defensive positions. They estimate success is achievable within 48 hours of initial landing. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, Supreme Commander of German forces in the West, shook his head in disbelief. The Americans have no understanding of modern warfare. They think war is won through industrial production and optimistic planning rather than tactical brilliance and defensive superiority. Their naivety will cost them an entire generation of soldiers when they attempt this madness. The German confidence was not baseless arrogance. It was mathematical certainty derived from military science, historical precedent, and 2 years of successful defensive operations that had stopped every Allied attempt to establish a foothold in Western Europe. The Atlantic Wall represented the culmination of German engineering expertise and defensive doctrine. Stretching from Norway to the Spanish border, it consisted of reinforced concrete bunkers, artillery positions, machine gun nests, anti-tank obstacles, and millions of mines. Every potential landing beach had been transformed into a killing zone, where attackers would face interlocking fields of fire from elevated defensive positions. German military planners had studied every major amphibious operation in military history. From Gallipoli to 1915 to Dieppe in 1942, the pattern was consistent. Defenders holding prepared positions enjoyed overwhelming advantages against forces attempting beach landings. The attacker had to cross open water under observation, approach beaches under fire, land troops in chaos while under direct attack, and somehow organize combat operations while suffering devastating casualties. The Dieppe raid in August 1942 had proven the futility of amphibious assault against prepared defenses. Canadian and British forces had attempted a beach landing at the French port of Dieppe with disastrous results. Of 5,000 men who landed, more than half became casualties within hours. The Germans had inflicted this defeat while suffering minimal losses themselves. Oberst Heinrich Müller, chief of coastal defense planning, had personally studied the Dieppe operation and concluded that beach assaults against modern defenses were tactically obsolete. The defender possesses every advantage in amphibious warfare. He knows the terrain, has prepared positions, can concentrate fire on predictable landing zones, and can respond with mobile reserves while the attacker struggles to establish even basic organization on hostile beaches. No amount of naval gunfire or air superiority can overcome these fundamental tactical realities. German defensive doctrine was built on this certainty. The Atlantic Wall was designed not merely to defeat an invasion, but to make it impossible. Every beach approach had been analyzed for vulnerability and reinforced with obstacles, mines, and bunkers positioned for maximum defensive efficiency. Artillery had been registered on every landing zone, ensuring accurate fire without need for ranging shots.
Machine gun positions were sited to create overlapping fire zones with no dead space where attackers could find cover. The fortifications were backed by mobile panzer divisions positioned to counterattack any attempted landing before it could establish a secure beachhead. German doctrine called for crushing beach assaults in the first hours before invading forces could bring their full strength to bear. General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, assigned to inspect Atlantic Wall defenses in late 1943, had intensified the fortification program based on his conviction that the invasion would be defeated on the beaches themselves. "We must stop them at the water's edge. The first 24 hours of invasion will be decisive for both sides. For the Allies as well as Germany, it will be the longest day." Rommel's inspection had revealed areas requiring improvement, but his overall assessment confirmed German confidence. The defenses were formidable, the doctrine was sound, and the defenders were experienced troops who had proven their capability in years of successful combat operations. The Allies would face an impossible task attempting to breach these fortifications. By January 1944, German intelligence had compiled extensive information about American planning for cross-channel invasion. The reports described training exercises in Britain, equipment concentrations, and logistical preparations that confirmed Allied intentions. What German analysts found most revealing was American tactical doctrine, which seemed to ignore every lesson of amphibious warfare that history had taught. The Americans planned to land troops directly on open beaches rather than capturing a port facility first. They intended to bring supplies across beaches rather than through established harbor infrastructure. They believed naval gunfire and aerial bombardment could suppress coastal defenses sufficiently to allow successful landings. Each assumption contradicted military science and historical precedent so thoroughly that German planners concluded American strategy was driven by political pressure rather than tactical realism. General Major Hans Speidel, Chief of Staff to Rommel, prepared a detailed analysis of American invasion planning that became required reading for all senior commanders in France. The American plan violates every principle of amphibious warfare. They seek to land on fortified beaches, establish supply lines across open water, and build up combat power faster than we can reinforce defensive positions. This strategy assumes perfect conditions, flawless execution, and passive defenders. Reality will teach them the cost of such optimism. The German assessment was supported by consultation with military theorists who had studied amphibious operations extensively. Professor General Heinz Guderian, the architect of German panzer doctrine, reviewed American plans and concluded they represented military fantasy rather than achievable strategy. Amphibious assault requires surprise, overwhelming force concentration, and rapid exploitation before defenders can respond. The Americans planned none of these elements. They telegraph their intentions, spread forces across multiple beaches, and assume they can survive the vulnerable period when troops are landing under fire. This is not strategy, but wishful thinking. What German strategists failed to understand was the revolutionary nature of American military planning that had transformed impossible challenges into solvable engineering problems through systematic innovation rather than traditional doctrine. While Germany relied on conventional military wisdom about amphibious operations being inherently doomed against prepared defenses, American planners had spent 2 years developing solutions to every tactical problem that made beach assaults supposedly impossible. The transformation began with a fundamental question that German planners had never seriously considered. What if defenders' advantages could be systematically negated through technological innovation, unprecedented logistics, and tactical methods that had never been attempted in military history? Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan, chief planner for the invasion, had assembled a team of officers, engineers, and logistics experts who approached the Channel crossing not as a traditional military operation, but as an engineering challenge requiring innovative solutions. Every tactical obstacle that made amphibious assault supposedly impossible became a specific problem requiring systematic solution. The challenge of crossing open water under observation was addressed through deception operations designed to convince Germans the invasion would occur elsewhere. The problem of landing under fire was tackled through naval gunfire plans that exceeded anything attempted in previous operations. The difficulty of supplying forces across beaches was solved by inventing artificial harbors that could be towed across the Channel and assembled in French waters. Each innovation represented thinking that German doctrine had never considered because it contradicted established military tradition.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. American planning recognized that defending the Atlantic Wall required German forces to be positioned correctly before invasion began. If defenders could be deceived about invasion location and timing, their defensive advantages would be negated regardless of fortification strength. The deception plan, codenamed Operation Bodyguard, represented the most elaborate military deception in history. Fake equipment, false radio traffic, and misinformation fed through controlled agents created the impression that invasion would target Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the channel, rather than Normandy beaches farther west. The deception was supported by a phantom army group supposedly commanded by General George Patton, positioned in southeast England opposite Calais. German intelligence, convinced of the deception's reality, concluded that any landing in Normandy would be a diversion rather than the main assault. This fundamental misunderstanding would prove more valuable than any amount of naval gunfire or troop strength. Colonel Friedrich August von der Heyte, commanding German paratroopers in Normandy, later acknowledged the deception's effectiveness. "We knew an invasion was coming, but were convinced it would strike at Calais. Our intelligence services were completely deceived by American misdirection. When Normandy was attacked, we believed it was a feint designed to draw reserves away from the real invasion that would follow at Calais." The naval gunfire plan addressed the problem of suppressing coastal defenses through firepower that exceeded anything German planners had conceived possible. American and British warships would deliver sustained bombardment using main battery guns that could fire hundreds of shells per hour at registered defensive positions. The bombardment would be coordinated with aerial attack using heavy bombers to crater defensive positions and disrupt German communications. German defensive doctrine assumed naval gunfire would be limited and ineffective against reinforced concrete bunkers. American planning called for sustained fire that would make defensive positions untenable regardless of fortification strength. The sheer volume of explosives would exceed German assumptions about what was logistically possible. Admiral Alan Kirk, commanding American naval forces for the invasion, had studied Dieppe and concluded that the Canadian failure resulted from inadequate fire support rather than inherent impossibility of beach assault. "We will deliver fire support that exceeds anything attempted in military history. Every defensive position will be targeted systematically, and German defenders will face a level of bombardment that makes coordinated defense impossible regardless of their courage or fortification quality." The artificial harbor solution addressed what German planners considered the insurmountable problem of logistics. Capturing a port facility required urban combat against prepared defenses, a process that could take weeks or months. Supplying forces across open beaches was considered impossible for extended operations due to weather, tides, and the vulnerability of landing craft. American engineers proposed a solution that seemed absurd to conventional military thinking. They would build artificial harbors in Britain, tow them across the channel in sections, and assemble them off Normandy beaches to create port facilities where none had existed. The Mulberry harbors represented engineering on a scale that German planners had never conceived. Major General Harold Wyman, overseeing harbor construction, defended the concept against skeptics in American command who thought it was impossible. "We are not constrained by what has been done before. We identify what needs to be achieved and engineer solutions regardless of conventional limitations. The harbors will work because we will make them work through systematic problem solving rather than accepting traditional constraints." The landing craft production addressed the fundamental problem of transporting massive forces across water and landing them directly on beaches rather than through port facilities. American industry had produced thousands of specialized vessels designed specifically for amphibious assault. Landing ship tanks could carry dozens of vehicles directly onto beaches. Landing craft infantry could transport troops and land them in shallow water. The scale of production exceeded German assumptions about what was logistically achievable. By May 1944, Allied forces had accumulated landing craft sufficient to transport entire divisions in single lifts, something German planners had considered impossible. The airborne assault plan addressed the problem of defending forces responding with mobile reserves while invasion forces struggled to organize on beaches. American and British paratroopers would drop behind coastal defenses hours before beach landings began, creating chaos in German rear areas and blocking roads that panzer divisions would need to reach invasion beaches. The airborne operations represented tactical innovation that German doctrine had not anticipated. Rather than landing all forces on beaches, the Allies would simultaneously attack from the sea and from inland, dividing German attention and preventing coordinated response.
Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway, commanding American airborne forces, understood the risks but believed the tactical advantages justified them. "We will suffer significant casualties from the drops themselves, but our presence behind German lines will prevent them from concentrating forces against beach landings. We trade our casualties for time and space that landing forces need to establish beachheads." The combined effect of these innovations was to transform what German doctrine considered impossible into an achievable operation through systematic solution of every tactical obstacle. American planning had identified each defender advantage and developed specific countermeasures that negated traditional defensive superiority. What remained was whether execution could match the ambition of the planning. The scale of preparation exceeded anything attempted in military history, and the stakes could not be higher. By April 1944, the invasion force assembled in Britain represented military power on a scale that dwarfed any previous operation. Over 150,000 troops would land on the first day. 5,000 ships would transport them across the Channel. 11,000 aircraft would provide air cover and bombing support. The logistics required to sustain this force after landing exceeded the total output of many industrialized nations. Yet, German commanders remained confident that the Atlantic Wall would defeat the assault regardless of Allied strength. Numbers alone could not overcome the fundamental tactical advantages that defenders held in amphibious warfare. Generaloberst Jodl, reviewing updated intelligence on Allied preparations, remained dismissive despite the obvious scale of the coming assault. "The Americans gather an impressive force, but lack understanding of the tactical realities they will face. Our defenses will channel them into killing zones where their numbers become a liability rather than an advantage. They will learn what the Canadians learned at Dieppe, that courage and equipment cannot overcome the mathematics of defensive warfare." The confidence extended throughout the German command structure in France. Officers who had successfully defended against Allied attacks in Italy and had witnessed the futility of frontal assaults against prepared positions could not imagine how even American industrial might could overcome entrenched defenders fighting from fortified positions with artillery support and panzer reserves available for immediate counterattack. General-Major Wilhelm Richter, commanding the 716th Infantry Division responsible for defending the beaches that would become known as Sword and Juno, expressed typical confidence during a staff meeting in late May. "My men are well trained, our positions are strong, and our fields of fire have been carefully prepared. The English Channel is our moat, and the beaches are our killing ground. Let the Americans come, we will write their obituary in the sand." What none of these confident commanders understood was that American planning had systematically addressed every source of their confidence. The deception plan had ensured they were looking in the wrong direction. The naval gunfire plan would deliver more explosives in hours than they had experienced in months of previous combat. The artificial harbors would solve logistics problems they considered unsolvable. The airborne assault would attack from directions they had not adequately defended. And the sheer scale of the operation would overwhelm defensive capacity regardless of individual position strength. The stage was set for the longest day, when German confidence built on military tradition and defensive doctrine would collide with American innovation, industrial might, and systematic problem-solving that had transformed impossible challenges into achievable objectives through engineering and planning rather than accepting conventional military wisdom about what could not be done. June 6, 1944, 06:30 hours. Omaha Beach, Normandy. Oberst Ernst Goth pressed his field glasses against his eyes and stared in disbelief at the horizon. The sea had disappeared. In its place stretched an armada so vast that it seemed to merge ocean and sky into a single mass of steel and smoke. Ships beyond counting filled every inch of visible water, their guns already beginning to speak in thunder that rolled across the Norman countryside like an approaching storm. Goth had commanded coastal artillery for 3 years. He had witnessed naval bombardments before, had endured Allied attacks in North Africa and Sicily, had even survived the intense fire support that preceded the Salerno landings. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he was witnessing now. The bombardment that began at first light did not follow the pattern of previous operations. There was no preliminary ranging fire, no gradual buildup of intensity. The Allied fleet simply opened fire with every gun simultaneously, creating a wall of explosives that transformed the beach defenses into a landscape of continuous detonations. The shells came in waves that followed so quickly they seemed to overlap. High explosive rounds from battleship main batteries cratered bunker positions. Destroyer guns walked fire across machine gun nests. Rocket ships unleashed salvos that carpeted entire grid squares with fragmentation. The mathematics of the bombardment exceeded anything German doctrine had considered possible. Individual positions designed to withstand direct hits were being struck repeatedly, the cumulative effect of multiple impacts exceeding the structural capacity of even the strongest reinforced concrete. Goth attempted to contact his battery positions to coordinate return fire, but communications had been severed in the first minutes of bombardment. Landlines had been cut by crater impacts. Radio antennas had been destroyed by shell fragments. Even runners could not move through the maelstrom of fire that made the surface impassable. His carefully prepared defensive network was being systematically dismantled by firepower that German planners had assured him was logistically impossible for attackers to sustain. Through brief gaps in the smoke, Goth caught glimpses of the landing craft beginning their approach. They came not in dozens, but in hundreds, wave after wave stretching back to the horizon. Each craft carried troops or vehicles or equipment, and the sheer scale of the assault made it clear that American plans called for landing an entire army in a single day, rather than the gradual buildup that German doctrine assumed would be necessary. Major Klaus Pluskat, commanding an artillery regiment positioned on the bluffs overlooking what the Americans designated as Omaha Beach, managed to establish telephone contact with his headquarters despite the bombardment. His voice carried shock rather than the confidence that had characterized German communications for months. "There must be 10,000 ships out there. The bombardment is beyond anything we prepared for. My forward positions are being destroyed faster than I can assess damage. This is not a raid or a diversion. This is the entire Allied army attempting to land simultaneously." The response from headquarters reflected the confusion that the invasion's scale and location had created throughout German command. Pluskat was told that the Normandy landing was likely a feint, that the real invasion would follow at Calais, that reserves must be held back rather than committed immediately. The doctrine that had been drilled into every German commander was to wait for the main attack rather than waste strength on diversions. This caution, built on reasonable military logic, was exactly what American planners had anticipated and exploited. Generalmajor Richter, whose confident predictions about defending his beaches had been delivered just days earlier, found his entire defensive plan collapsing within the first hour. The bombardment had severed his communications with forward units. The airborne assault that had begun hours before the beach landings had created chaos in his rear areas, blocking roads and preventing the movement of reserves.
His carefully registered artillery positions were being destroyed before they could fire organized volleys at landing craft. Most devastating was the realization that the invasion was occurring exactly where his defenses were positioned, but with such overwhelming force that defensive advantages were being negated through sheer scale and firepower. He had prepared to face an assault force that would attempt to land gradually, establishing a toehold before building up strength. Instead, the Americans were attempting to land their entire invasion force in the first hours, accepting heavy casualties in exchange for speed that would prevent organized German response. The naval gunfire continued without pause as landing craft reached the beaches. German doctrine had assumed that bombardment would lift once troops began landing to avoid friendly fire casualties. American planning made no such assumption. Naval observers directed fire at defensive positions even as troops struggled across the beaches, accepting the risk of short rounds in exchange for continuous suppression of German defenses. Oberleutnant Heinrich Severlaw, manning a machine gun position overlooking Omaha Beach, survived the naval bombardment through luck and the strength of his bunker's construction. As landing craft dropped their ramps and American troops began crossing the beach, he opened fire with discipline born of 3 years of combat experience.
His machine gun had clear fields of fire across the beach approaches, and the first waves of American infantry were caught in the open exactly as German defensive doctrine predicted. The slaughter was immediate and terrible. American troops fell in windows, cut down before they could reach cover. The tide turned red with blood. Bodies piled at the waterline where defensive fire was most concentrated. For 30 minutes, German defensive doctrine seemed to be proving correct despite the unprecedented bombardment. Attackers were suffering devastating casualties attempting to cross killing zones under direct fire from elevated positions. Severlaw later recalled the moment when he believed the invasion would fail despite its scale. "I fired until my machine gun barrel glowed red. American soldiers fell with every burst. They kept coming in waves, but we were killing them faster than they could advance. I thought we were witnessing the greatest military disaster in history, that the beaches would run with blood until the Americans gave up their mad attempt." But what Severlaw and his fellow defenders could not see from their fixed positions was that the pattern of attack was different from anything German doctrine had anticipated. American troops were not retreating despite catastrophic casualties. Naval gunfire was systematically destroying defensive positions even as troops continued landing. Combat engineers were blowing gaps in beach obstacles under fire. Tanks were landing and engaging bunkers directly. The assault continued with mechanical persistence that ignored losses which would have caused any rational commander to call off the attack. The doctrine that successful beach defense required breaking the attacker's will through heavy casualties assumed defenders could maintain fire superiority long enough for attackers to lose heart. American planning had accepted that casualties would be severe, but had built the assault force large enough to absorb terrible losses and continue attacking. Every wave that came ashore reinforced those already there, creating cumulative strength that eventually exceeded defensive capacity regardless of the tactical advantages that fixed positions provided. By 0800 hours, Severlaw's ammunition was running low. His bunker had been struck multiple times by naval gunfire, and while the structure remained intact, nearby positions had been destroyed. American troops were beginning to find dead ground where defensive fire could not reach them. Combat engineers had blown gaps in obstacles, allowing vehicles to reach the beach. The systematic advantages that German defensive doctrine relied upon were being overcome through persistence and firepower that exceeded all planning assumptions. Hauptmann Werner Pluskat, Klaus's brother, who commanded nearby defenses, radioed a desperate assessment to division headquarters. "The Americans are establishing themselves despite heavy casualties. Our defensive fire is being suppressed by naval gunfire we cannot counter. Every position we have is being targeted systematically. They are not retreating. They are reinforcing failure and turning it into success through sheer stubborn persistence." The confusion at higher headquarters reflected the success of Allied deception operations. Even as American and British forces fought desperately on Normandy beaches, German commanders remained convinced that the main invasion would follow at Calais. Panzer divisions that could have counterattacked the beaches remained in reserve, awaiting an invasion that would never come. The systematic deception had achieved what firepower alone could not, ensuring that German defenders would face the assault without the mobile reserves that doctrine said were necessary to defeat beach landings. Generaloberst Jodl, receiving reports from Normandy at his headquarters far from the fighting, struggled to reconcile what was being reported with what German doctrine said should be happening. The reports described Allied forces landing across multiple beaches simultaneously, establishing themselves despite casualties, and building combat power faster than German defenders could respond. This contradicted everything military science taught about amphibious operations against prepared defenses. His first assessment, shared with Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, reflected the cognitive dissonance that the invasion's success was creating throughout German command. The Normandy operation may be succeeding tactically, but it remains a diversion. The Americans cannot sustain operations across open beaches. They must capture a port facility, and Normandy beaches offer no such capability. The main invasion will follow at Calais, where port facilities exist. We must not commit reserves to a diversion regardless of its apparent success. This assessment, logical according to conventional military wisdom, was exactly wrong. American planning had solved the port problem through artificial harbors that German intelligence had never discovered. Even as Jodl insisted on holding reserves for the real invasion at Calais, construction crews were beginning to assemble Mulberry Harbor components off the Normandy beaches. Within days, the supposed impossibility of supplying forces across open beaches would be overcome through engineering that German doctrine had never considered. By noon on June 6th, American forces had established precarious footholds on all designated beaches, despite suffering over 2,000 casualties at Omaha alone. The cost had been terrible, exceeding even pessimistic American planning estimates. But the landings had succeeded where German doctrine insisted they must fail. Troops were ashore, vehicles were landing, and the buildup of combat power was proceeding despite continued German resistance. General Major Richter, whose beach defenses had been the target of the fiercest assault, reported to his headquarters with an assessment that acknowledged the fundamental failure of German defensive doctrine. Our positions have been overrun or bypassed. The Americans accepted casualties that should have broken any attack and continued with mechanical persistence. Naval gunfire suppressed our positions more effectively than we thought possible. Airborne assault prevented reserve movement. The invasion has succeeded despite our preparations, because American planning addressed every advantage our defenses provided. The afternoon brought the beginning of systematic Allied expansion inland. German defenders who had survived the initial assault found themselves facing an enemy who continued landing reinforcements while their own support could not reach them. Roads inland were blocked by airborne forces. Panzer reserves remained held back by orders from headquarters convinced the real invasion was yet to come. Individual strongpoints fought with courage, but were systematically reduced by combined arms tactics that brought overwhelming force against each position sequentially. Rommel, who had been in Germany for his wife's birthday when the invasion began, raced back to France and immediately grasped what other commanders had not yet accepted. The invasion has succeeded.
Normandy is not a diversion, but the main assault. We have been deceived about location and overwhelmed by scale. Our doctrine was correct about defensive advantages, but the Americans solved every problem through innovation and persistence we did not believe possible. His assessment, delivered to von Rundstedt and forwarded to Berlin, marked the beginning of German acceptance that American planning had achieved what German military science insisted was impossible. The Atlantic Wall had not failed through weakness, but had been overcome through systematic solution of every defensive advantage it provided. The June 7th reports documented the magnitude of American achievement. Over 150,000 troops had landed on the first day. Artificial harbor construction was proceeding on schedule. Allied forces held a continuous beachhead 30 miles wide and several miles deep. German counterattacks had been blocked by airborne forces or broken up by naval gunfire. The buildup of Allied combat power was proceeding faster than German reserves could be concentrated for counterattack. Generaloberst Jodl, reviewing the reports with dawning horror, understood that the entire German defensive strategy for France had been undermined by American planning that had systematically addressed every assumption German doctrine relied upon. We calculated that beach assaults against prepared defenses must fail through tactical mathematics. The Americans changed the mathematics through deception, firepower, innovation, and persistence that our doctrine never anticipated. They succeeded not through military genius, but through systematic problem-solving that treated warfare as engineering rather than art. The following weeks brought systematic German defeat across Normandy as the initial success of the landings translated into sustained operations that German forces could not counter. The artificial harbors enabled supply rates that exceeded those of established ports. Allied air superiority prevented German daytime movement. The buildup of American and British forces proceeded faster than German reserves could arrive to oppose them. By the end of June, over 800,000 Allied troops had landed in Normandy through beaches that German planners had insisted could not sustain major operations. The Mulberry harbors were functioning as designed, delivering thousands of tons of supplies daily. Allied air superiority prevented German daytime movement.
The buildup of American and British forces proceeded faster than German reserves could arrive to oppose them. By the end of June, over 800,000 Allied troops had landed in Normandy through beaches that German planners had insisted could not sustain major operations. The Mulberry harbors were functioning as designed, delivering thousands of tons of supplies daily. Allied breakout operations were beginning to penetrate beyond the initial beachhead into the French interior. Oberst Goth, whose artillery positions had been among the first destroyed on June 6, reflected on the invasion's success during his interrogation after being captured. "We prepared to face an enemy who would follow conventional military doctrine. The Americans wrote new doctrine through systematic innovation. They identified every advantage our defenses provided and developed specific countermeasures. Our confidence was not arrogance, but reasonable assessment based on military science. What we failed to understand was that American planning did not accept scientific limitations, but treated them as engineering problems requiring systematic solutions." The broader German military establishment struggled to comprehend how such a fundamental defeat had occurred against defenses they had considered impregnable. Post-battle analysis revealed the systematic nature of American planning that had addressed every element of German defensive strategy. The deception had ensured forces were positioned incorrectly. The naval gunfire had suppressed defenses more effectively than thought possible. The artificial harbors had solved logistics problems considered unsolvable. The airborne assault had prevented mobile response. The sheer scale had overwhelmed defensive capacity through persistence rather than tactical elegance. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.